Let's get started. Hi everyone, my name is Catriona Power. I'm the VP of Partnerships and Strategy here at a Foresight Clean Technology Accelerator. Thank you so much for making time today to join the next edition in our Future Economy series. Today we're going to focus on the energy sector. We will go through a presentation and we're also joined by a great group of panelists as well. Looking forward to the session today. On our agenda, we will do a quick round of welcome and introductions with the panelists. We will then go into a short presentation for 5 minutes with a focus on the energy sector and a review of existing roadmaps for the sector. We will then move on to a moderated panel discussion, and then we will have a Q&A and closing remarks for the last 10 to 15 minutes. If you have any questions, please do post them in the Q&A chat at any time, and we will make sure that they are answered. Thank you. I will now pass it over to our guest speakers to introduce themselves. We will start with Mark, then Madeline, Cole, and David. Thank you.
Happy lunch hour, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Mark Warren. I'm the Director of Business Innovation at Fortis BC, and I do a number of things at the company, and I've had a lot of roles over the years, but one of my primary focuses at the minute is helping us deliver on our climate action improvements that we've outlined in our through our 30 by 30 initiative, which I'm sure I'll be mentioning as we talk further. Nice to meet everybody.
Hi everyone, my name is Madeline McPherson. I lead the Sustainable Energy Systems Integration and Transitions Research Group at the University of Victoria. So I work with, I guess I have about 10 grad students now who are working across the energy system, transportation, buildings, electricity, both planning and operations, and really trying to take a more holistic perspective of the energy system and its transition to low carbon and sustainability, particularly through integration. So thanks very much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to a productive conversation today.
And Cole?
Yes, hi everyone, my name is Cole Sayers. I work at the New Relationship Trust and I manage the BC Indigenous Clean Energy Initiatives. We are at the NRT, our goal is capacity building in First Nations communities, and with the BC Indigenous Clean Energy, we kind of see this more of a holistic way to build capacity in communities with clean energy. And through this initiative, we partner with the federal government and BC in order to build capacity and build these clean energy projects to meet community needs. We are a multi-stage initiative, so we help projects early stages, how we started, but we also support later stages. And so I'm happy to join today. Thank you for having me.
Cool, and I'll pass it over to David as well.
Hello all, so David Sanguinetti. I'm also with Foresight, and my role as part of this is project manager for the project and also facilitator of the panel discussion. I'm not an electrical engineer, I'm chemical by training, so I don't claim any expertise here. I'm going to be deferring to Mark and Madeline and Cole to bring their expertise in on the discussion, but I do have a background, I guess, on the energy side in different alternatives. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion because we got 3 people here from 3 different backgrounds, but really great combination looking at what is an absolutely critical area in this province right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all our panelists for joining us today. So we'll start with what is the Cleantech Core, the Core Cleantech Cluster. It's a new initiative facilitated by Foresight, and our mission is to support a clean economy and position BC as a global leader in innovation, talent, and capital to scale clean tech. We do that by bridging partnerships and facilitating discussions with investors, with SMEs, with corporations, industry, as well as academia and government to be able to support and identify where those gaps are, facilitate those engagements, and really drive home clean tech projects to support adoption, to support investment attraction, and also export revenues. It's a new initiative. It launched in July 2020, earlier this month, and there's a report online if you're interested in learning more about our strategy. The goals of the initiative are to strengthen local and global partnerships to accelerate activities for a clean economy, to showcase BC as a place to invest in clean tech companies and projects, to facilitate and engage stakeholders for impactful collaborative clean tech projects in BC, to foster talent and skills for clean tech commercialization and scale up. As we know, this is one of the biggest barriers we have in the clean tech development sector, those particularly larger scale projects and also later stage in terms of technology commercialization. And also to promote opportunities and programs to help increase international exports and increase revenues as well for the province. The sectors that we focus on are built environment, natural resources, agriculture and food, energy, transportation, and water. So for today's session, we're going to base our discussion on a roadmap landscape review of the energy sector. This is some research that our team has been doing at Foresight and at the Core Cleantech Cluster. And we have created a snapshot of roadmaps and approaches in use in the sector in relation to meeting climate targets for 2030 up to 2050. You can find all this information available on the Core Cleantech website. What's really interesting is that we found that decarbonising the energy sector in BC requires a market-driven approach guided by the end user. And that interviews with industry players revealed a number of low-carbon technologies, fuels and energy sources under consideration as major contributors to the energy transition. So we have mapped out what are the current energy sources, renewable electricity, natural gas, and also what is the potential like hydrogen and bioenergy, as you can see here on the left. We have looked at the supply side considerations, the demand side considerations, and also the GHG considerations. So for example, renewable electricity is quite common in BC because it's a hydroelectric power grid for the most part. What we are finding is that with electrification, there's growing demand, and that requires some planning and some thinking around, well, what does that demand look like? And what do we have enough generation and transmission to support it? The GHG considerations for that are no emission at end use, as most electricity in BC comes from clean hydroelectric. And so we've done the same for natural gas, hydrogen and bioenergy. You can learn more about these in the report. I'm also happy to put the slide up later as well as part of the discussion. What we found in BC is there are competing visions in terms of energy roadmaps. There are a number of roadmaps in use to guide the energy transition that are focused on particular technologies and energy sources, but there isn't necessarily a roadmap that is bringing all these together to really have that common vision and common outlook as to how we're going to achieve this. So for example, in the electricity sector, we know that BC Hydro has a phase 2 review ongoing, and that is their roadmap. In natural gas, we know that there is a pan-Canadian RNG roadmap, and also that Fortis BC has their Clean Growth Pathway to 2050 roadmap. In hydrogen, we have the BC British Columbia Hydrogen Study, which was commissioned by the province and completed by a number of sponsors and people. And in bioenergy, we have the bioenergy strategy and also the Canada's bioeconomy strategy as well. So we have all these different strategies, but there isn't necessarily one vision, bringing all these people together to really understand what are technologies and energy sources that we need to be focusing on to drive decarbonisation. In terms of our observations to support in bridging the gap, and for the electricity sector, we find that BC Hydro has a huge impact in terms of and influence on the future energy path in BC. We found that they're not necessarily engaging with discussions around alternative fuels. We found that an expanded transmission network would ensure more of the country benefits, as well as the ability to transition to clean energy, particularly for electrification. In hydrogen, we noticed that there is a growing demand for hydrogen. There's a lot of talk about the hydrogen economy as an energy source to help decarbonisation of hard to abate sectors. But to transition to that, there will need to be a means to transport hydrogen within and out of the province as well, through pipelines and things like that. For natural gas, we know that Fortis BC is working on expanding their focus into renewable gas and also blue and green hydrogen to align with the Clean BC plan. We also know there's an initiative underway to export LNG and to create what is the least carbon intensive operation as possible, and therefore become more competitive as an exporter of LNG gas. In bioenergy, low carbon liquid fuels and RNG do have a role to play in replacing conventional natural gas for applications where conversion to electricity is not necessarily practical or cost effective, but the price is sometimes higher than regular natural gas. And there's also some pricing concerns around renewable diesel and aviation fuel as well, as they look to continue to commercialize the technology at scale. We have outlined a number of recommendations for each of these technology sectors. So electricity, we have learned that transmission is one of the biggest constraints to further electrification. It is highly capital intensive, and this should be looked into as we are considering further electrification processes. There should be future opportunities for more power generation through a revised and renewed independent power producer program. Distributed power and ownership of this type of infrastructure should be addressed as part of economic development planning as well. For natural gas, we highlight that there is an opportunity to produce blue hydrogen from natural gas, and exporting it should be further explored as a competitive technology and energy source. And also that an LNG roadmap project should be undertaken as quickly as possible to help define a pathway and opportunity to create a collaborative vision for the industry to work towards. And within that, include low carbon technologies, whether that is the scope for blue hydrogen or scope for CCUS, carbon capture technologies as well. For hydrogen, we note and recommend that a decision needs to be made regarding the pathway for that. There's a lot of talk and there's a lot of strategy reports developed around a hydrogen economy in BC. And we also noted that the BC Hydrogen Study provided a series of action steps as well to work towards it. And for the bioenergy sector, for it to become a more viable sector in the mid and long term, we need to better understand the economics of RNG and other biofuels, particularly when we're talking about feedstock, as well as other sort of technology considerations as well. But the priority recommendation that is coming out of this report is to develop a top-level decision tree regarding the future direction of this province with regards to energy pathways. What we found is that there's a number of different pathways, there's a number of different roadmaps, and everyone is working towards those goals, but not all together and not all at the same time or at the same pace. Key decisions to discuss include, is BC going to support hydrogen as a major energy source and fuel? If yes, will this strategy be to focus on internal use or develop an export market? Once the decisions are made, we need to then follow up and to learn more. Well, how much more electricity production and transmission will be required, and how much bioenergy would be needed, and also in what form? And so our panelists and David are going to discuss today these recommendations in more detail. Thank you for listening, and happy to answer any questions you may have. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Catriona. So as you can see, there are a lot of recommendations, especially if you've watched any of our previous webinars. There's an awful lot more to chew on here, which I think is reflective of the significance of energy as far as the current GHG emissions in the province, and really the pathways and strategies in order to achieve our Clean BC goals. So I'm going to throw it over now to our three panelists in turn, just starting off with your initial feedback on these recommendations, particularly the high priority recommendation, the decision tree, but any of the other ones that struck you, and get your feedback on those. So we'll start with you, Mark, if you could weigh in from your perspective on those recommendations.
Hi, thanks everybody. I should have mentioned in my introduction actually that Fortis BC is a natural gas distributor in the province. Probably most people are aware of that. People may not be aware, however, that we're also a vertically integrated electric company in the province. So we serve the southern central portion of the interior. We have 5 hydroelectric dams on the Kootenay River. And so really we've got a horse in both of the major races here of gas and electricity. As we're going through the presentation, I'm very supportive of the roadmap that as it's being put forward here. We believe that the best way forward to reduce emissions in the most cost-effective manner possible is going to require a variety of solutions. And I think that the roadmap really hits on all of those, and that we at Fortis BC are working on all of those pathways as we speak. I think I'll leave it at there for this intro.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Madeline.
Yeah, so I think I certainly agree with the top priority recommendation there to develop a decision tree. I think my perspective coming sort of mostly from a modeling background and from a systems perspective is as we start to move towards electrification or deep decarbonization, all of the systems together start to become really important, right? And so we're sort of at a place, I think, especially in BC, I think we're lucky in BC that already our electricity system is so decarbonized. Not to say there's not other environmental and social issues, but decarbonized. So then we start, as Clean BC is doing, start to shift our attention more onto the transport, building, industry sectors, so on and so forth. And in order to do that, whether we're talking about hydrogen or electrification or other renewable or sustainable fuels, what we start to see is energy carriers having to be moved between these different parts of the energy system that have historically had little to do with one another, right? The transport system had relatively little to do with the electricity system from an energy vector perspective, and also from an institutional perspective. These were different companies, these were different players, these were different policymakers, and these were different infrastructure systems as well from a physical perspective. So as we start to move down this deep decarbonization pathway, I think one of the things that starts to become really important is the intersection between these different infrastructure systems and then the key stakeholders that are involved in each. And so I think that high level priority or top level recommendation that you have to create a decision tree is a really important one, because it does point to the fact that we have this in a lot of ways new problem of trying to integrate across these different systems and integrate on a number of different levels, physically, politically, or from a policy perspective in terms of energy vectors, so on and so forth. So I think, the two that you raise on this slide, for example, hydrogen and transmission, are two really good examples of carriers that start to bridge these different systems and also bridge jurisdictions, whether they're provincial jurisdictions or international jurisdictions, for an export market versus an internal market, so on and so forth. So it's sort of, I think it's difficult to start to answer any of these questions in isolation. Do we need more hydrogen? Do we need more transmission? Do we need more electricity generation? It's really difficult to answer any of those questions taking a single systems perspective, just looking at the electricity system or just looking at the transport system. I think it's really important to be able to answer those questions well, to be able to really take a holistic perspective, looking at all of those different types of infrastructure systems together. And of course, that's immensely challenging to do, right? It's difficult to do from a modeling perspective, which is sort of my background, where I come from, but it's also difficult to do from an institutional perspective. You know, these are fundamentally different institutions who have not necessarily developed relationships or had conversations over the years. It's difficult to do from a jurisdiction perspective. What are municipalities versus the province versus the federal government doing at all of those different scales, and what policy levers do each of those different jurisdictions have with one another? And then difficult to do from a interprovincial perspective, so on and so forth. So I think it's very difficult to do, and I don't mean to undermine the difficulty of it by any stretch, but I do think that it is the most imperative, or one of the most important things that we have to do before we can get to any of the sort of more system-specific questions that you raise in your document or in your slide deck.
Excellent, thank you. Now, Cole, can you give us your perspective on those recommendations?
Yes, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Madeline. I guess from my perspective, I guess I'll just speak to First Nations perspective and kind of how we see ourselves fitting into this. One recommendation in particular stands out is around electricity transmission and the call for a renewed program for independent power producers, because that's one of the ways that First Nations have entered the clean energy industry on our own terms. And I think that's key, is that this is something that we've come to on our own terms. And I think that the clean energy industry have many great examples of how we can work together to build this energy transition. And because I think one thing that we need to consider with the energy transition is that it also has to be a just transition. And the political environment that we're operating in is not very friendly to First Nations right now with Site C, with not working with First Nations. It's against us. And with the passing of the UNDRIP bill, this is a new era where we have to build a transition, and that includes working with First Nations, with the top level decision making with First Nations there, so that we don't replicate the same problems that we've had with Site C. And I think a lot of British Columbians would agree, it's not just First Nations lands that are being destroyed, it's also farmlands and ranchers that are being affected. And it has large impacts to the north, to the Peace River, to the Delta, and the northern Alberta, and the north of the Dene. So we can't have those big destructive projects. And we need to, when we think about decarbonization, we also have to include decolonization so that we don't replicate the colonial history. And we can do that with clean energy, with First Nations included in these projects, and with a call for independent power production. I think that is one way that we could open things up for First Nations to be part of the conversation. And I think I'll pick up on Mark's point. We have to have creative solutions, but First Nations have to be a part of those conversations, and to have actual decision-making power. We can't just be an afterthought like this current government and past governments have done. We have to be at the decision-making table and how we address these systemic problems with the transmission and energy production. And so that's what I would like to hope. That's what I hope for, is that we can work in partnership in addressing these issues together. And I think we have a really good. I think we're starting. Clean BC, we're getting there, but we still have lots of work to do. And I think that a lot of people in the industry see that, and I hope that things can change for not just First Nations, but I think the clean energy industry. But I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Cole. So now I'd like to dive in a little bit. I mean, I'm hearing from all of you that it's not a simple question, that there's an awful lot going on here. When we look at the decision tree, and that there's different questions that we've proposed, I'd like to get your take on either supporting just these questions, or more likely that there's more questions that need to be asked and answered as well. And can I get perhaps some suggestions from you on what other questions need to be asked and answered in order to get us pointing in the right direction? let's go back in the other direction now. So Cole, if you could jump in on that, if you got any suggestions of what particular questions need to be answered right away in order to make sure we're pointing in the right direction.
Well, I think, first of all, consulting First Nations who are part of clean energy, who have clean energy projects or partners or have an equity stake in clean energy partners, I think they have to be included. And I don't think they, in the phase 2 review of BC Hydro, I don't think that the consultation process was very comprehensive. So I think that the first step is including us, those who are actually involved and who will be largely affected, because they tried to enforce force majeure and canceled contracts due to the pandemic after other attacks to our industry. So there's just no consultation at all. So that's the first thing that has to change. Is that we have to work together and consult the First Nations who are going to be largely impacted, because these projects have a huge impact. These, like my community, Hupachasset, the revenue that we generate from our project is the same or more than the funding we get from Indigenous Service Canada. So if our contract was canceled and it's looking like it won't be renewed in 5 years, that's $1 million that we're not going to get in our community. And so there's this sort of like, I call it just transition, because it is like we rely on these projects to generate revenue. And so, yeah, being part of the conversation, I think, is the first step, and I think that'll help inform the next step in terms of how can we create a more friendly political and policy environment so that we can have the ability to be creative, because right now I don't think we have that ability. And Fortis BC has several projects that they are supportive of for First Nations, but my understanding is they don't have the authority to buy power from those projects, so those projects then can't go forward. It's the same with all the other First Nations projects, and I hear from many First Nations who, were putting all this money into feasibility studies, buying permits. Then up until 2017, when the Standing Offer program was canceled, all those projects, all that money, gone. And, the industry was just taking off, and then the rug was taken out from underneath their feet. And First Nations finally had this industry where we could, it falls within our values. It would create a reliable source of energy. It avoided diesel generation. It helps end-of-line communities grow their economy, because, imagine going to Tofino, but having brownouts, when you're trying to do a Zoom call in Tofino on vacation, Now, Cleantech has 3 run-of-river projects that power the West Coast, and they're a reliable source of power. On the other side of the valley, Hawaii, they kind of have that other parts, like end-of-line communities, they have that issue where power goes out for, several hours, days, or weeks. And you can't build your economy without a reliable source of power. So there's definitely different aspects to, First Nations needs, because, BC is big, and sources of fuel are different. But yeah, I'll leave it there for now so I don't take too much time, but thank you.
Excellent. I noticed Mark nodding his head, but I said we'd go in reverse order. So I'll let Madeline go next on what are the questions you see that we need to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with Cole and Cole's remarks there. I think that I think that, and we really need a consortium of stakeholders, as Cole's really pointing to, but as well as players or actors from these different infrastructure systems, researchers, policymakers from different jurisdictional scales, and I think we need sort of a strategic community of or consortium of these individuals who are spanning different interest groups, different infrastructure systems, different perspectives from a research perspective or from a disciplinary perspective, to be able to come up with those creative solutions that Catriona was sort of talking about at the beginning. And I think maybe one of our challenges in the Canadian context or in the BC context is that we don't necessarily have the institutional infrastructure to sort of enable this. So I worked for a while in the Department of Energy down in the States, and there's sort of a, you know, an institutional infrastructure there, not to say that it's perfect or that it works all the time, but that really links, you know, the research going on in the national labs up to the policymakers, the bureaucrats and the policymakers sitting in Washington at the Department of Energy. And there's, you know, these relationships, individual and institutional relationships that have been built over, you know, decades and decades. And these relationships that then can start to bring in, you know, different perspectives, whether that's the market perspective, in technology, scaling, cost, so on and so forth. But we have a little bit of a gap, I think, in the Canadian context when it comes to sort of this institutional infrastructure. And so I think that we need to think, we also have a completely different climate in terms of the stakeholders who need to be in the rooms and the kinds of conversations that we need to be having. And so I think as far as the creative solutions goes, I think that we need to be thinking about what that consortium of people or capacity would look like in order to fill that gap, that conversation gap, that communication and stakeholder gap, but also the research and infrastructure gap. And then I think that from there, we could start to move from where we are now with these sort of competing visions that Catriona presented on her slide, which I think those competing visions really come in some sense from these siloed perspectives, right? We all, you know, as Mark was saying, different horses in the game here, and you know, and we can all sort of optimize the system or the pathway forward according to our own assumptions, our own value systems, our own context, the, you know, the different resources or policies or levers that we have at our own disposal, depending on where we're sitting within this broader ecosystem. So I think that, you know, to be able to bring a consortium together where we can start to have this conversation from a more holistic perspective, different perspectives, different stakeholders, coming from different parts of the energy system, different goals, so on and so forth, and to try to see where there are synergies between these competing visions and where we can start to work towards a pathway or a path forward that is inclusive and just, and it is a, you know, just and decarbonized path forward, really from a much broader perspective.
Excellent, thank you. And then Mark, I'll give you your chance now.
So, you know, I think the key question we need to answer is how we're going to realize a clean growth pathway without mega projects in this province. And so, you know, for lots of different reasons, including First Nations concerns, I think that the days of building another Site C or you know, exploring more natural gas fields or building new pipelines, as we can see, these things are fraught with complications and for lots of good reasons, including First Nations concerns. And so, you know, anybody who's counting on electrification as the magic bullet to solve all the problems that is a very problematic pathway by itself, as we've been talking about. You know, simply, you know, if we remove the gas system today, you'd require multiple Site Cs to replace it in terms of size. And in terms of small IPPs, it's going to be lots and lots. So the future is going to look like a lot of smaller projects in partnership with lots of different parts of the province and First Nations and communities and that kind of thing. And they're not just going to be electricity projects. They're not just going to be solar farms and wind projects and that kind of thing. They're going to be, you know, woody biomass conversion projects and those kind of things as well, you know, where we're creating renewable gases and that sort of thing. And I think that is an extremely big challenge, right? Is because we have relied, the energy sector, and we're guilty of this as more than anybody probably, we have relied on mega projects in the past. And I think that's going to be a major challenge.
Thank you. And while you're there, Mark, there's a question that's come in that I'm going to toss in your direction, if you can at least quickly speak to it. Concern about LNG and it as a polluting fuel. It does, and as we mentioned in our report, although it reduces emissions compared to gasoline or coal, it still has a significant GHG footprint. We can't switch everything over to LNG and expect to meet anywhere near the goals that we've set. So the question is, how can we justify LNG?
I guess in a couple of different ways. If you're looking for practical solutions for today, LNG and CNG play a role. We are decarbonizing the province today by displacing diesel fuel in trucking and ferries, where batteries or other electric options, purely or hydrogen options, fuel cell options, electric drive options simply aren't options. There's nothing on the market today to do it. We're working on those things. We at Fortis and the industry generally is working on those things, but they're not available today. And so, as much as you may say it's a polluting fossil fuel, it's better than diesel, and that's a good interim step. And as far as LNG exports go, that is, what we're doing there is we're displacing, again, higher carbon fuels in other jurisdictions. Yeah, I mean, we don't get a direct benefit in BC, but to the extent that we're displacing carbon emissions in Asia, I think we'd all agree that's a good thing.
Excellent, thank you. So that actually segues very nicely into another question that are these goals that we've set, are these recommendations enough to actually get us to the Clean BC goals, enough to achieve IPCC 1.5? Madeline, what's your take on that? Or if we look at this decision tree that we've talked about, is answering those questions and moving in this direction, is it enough, or do we need to do something more?
Well, I think, in terms of the electricity system, we're pretty good standing. I mean, we're obviously not entirely there, but even across Canada, and particularly in BC, we have a relatively decarbonized electricity system, although of course there's still a ways to go there. And then when it comes to the renewable natural gas and hydrogen efforts, I think that those are a little bit further behind just from a timeline perspective. Just this morning, actually, I was listening to a National Academies of Sciences workshop about enhancing clean energy innovation, very much from an American perspective. But, I think we are definitely within this broader ecosystem, especially when it comes to these more transformative technologies. And Shell's Sky scenario, which is one of their most aggressive scenarios in terms of hydrogen, really doesn't see hydrogen taking off until 2050 or 2060. And so that's, that is, if we were to replicate that within the BC context, that's too late for sure to meet both the Clean BC goals or the IPCC 1.5 target. So, so I think that it's if we actually were to, of course, decarbonize the whole system across the whole system, then we would, but there's those sticky issues that are left at the end, right? The big industrial, cement making, aviation, those very tricky sectors that are left at the end of once the electricity system and even the gas system is decarbonized, and even the short haul transportation system. We can sort of the pathway is, to my mind, the pathway is relatively clear there in terms of decarbonizing from a technology perspective, from an innovation perspective, in terms of decarbonizing those. But those last few sectors, I think, we have a ways to go there. I'm maybe still naively hopeful, but I think, every year that goes by, every month that goes by, we're getting further and further away from the possibility of being able to hit that. And of course, there's already still so much momentum and inertia in the system, in the global system. So I think it's important to recognize the difference between the sort of short-term pathways that perhaps we have a little bit more certainty on, in technologies and spaces where decarbonization is perhaps we have got a pretty good roadmap for how to get there, and also the difference between BC and the globe more generally, right? When we talk about 1.5 degrees, we're talking about the entire globe, not just what BC can do. So I think there's the sort of, I would sort of picture that as the 4 different quadrants of answering that question: BC, the globe, short-term, long-term. And I think the answer to that question that you have up is really varies depending on which of those 4 quadrants we're sort of sitting in.
Right. Okay. I also have a question here, or it's a statement that they're looking for comment on, but it very much relates to things that certainly Mark and Cole have both been talking about, which is distributed energy generation. And you know, you've both spoken in favor of it to an extent. To what extent can distributed energy generation actually meet some of the province's needs? And actually, I think all 3 of you might have something to say on that. So we'll start with you, Cole, but I'd like to hear from the others of you as well. To what extent, whether it's through independent power producers or even the utilities doing distributed power generation, to what extent can that actually meet our needs? Starting with you, Cole.
Well, in my opinion, I think that it's usually important. I think because the First Nations are already, trying to build projects, but are unable to. I think that's the first step. I think is looking at that distributed energy system and really learning what First Nations needs are, depending on their regions and what their goals are, because it varies. But maybe I'll just defer to Mark and Madeline as I gather my thoughts.
Okay, fair enough. Mark, you want to jump in then?
Yes, we think, we don't really think about them as distributed energy projects, but pretty much everything that we're looking at as to get us to our 20 by 30 goal of 30% reduction in emissions and our 2050 goal of being neutral are in fact distributed projects. And so people may or may not be aware that today we're already producing and selling RNG, renewable natural gas, and the first natural gas utility in North America to do that. But it's in incredibly small amounts right now. And so we've been looking for, government support to invest in more research, invest in more projects in that space. And they've been very supportive of us doing that. The next step is hydrogen. Although I think we're away from producing hydrogen in large amounts, the ability to produce it in small amounts in different parts of the province is going to be upon us soon. And the natural gas system is a way to absorb a large amount of that. And that's a key pillar of what we're doing, is that a number of small hydrogen generation projects scattered across the province and injecting hydrogen into the natural gas system. And we're running testing in conjunction with UBC right now that shows that, we can blend up, and it's being done in Europe as well, you can blend up to 10 or 20% hydrogen into the natural gas system and not affect end uses in people's houses. So it's a difficult pathway, but this distributed pathway, but we believe it's possible. It's super aggressive, we'll say that. We need to produce, for example, almost 100 times more renewable gases by 2030 than we're producing today. And we've started up that curve, and we've added a lot of capacity this year, but yes, big challenge ahead of us.
Thank you, Madeline. So you've done the modeling on this to some extent, at least. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, I would refer back to one of Mark's statements earlier, which I think, you know, all of these solutions, I think we need to look at and have a role. And I think, you know, especially from a broader stakeholder perspective and from an inclusivity perspective and a socially just perspective, you know, distributed generation definitely has a compelling role to play in a lot of ways. I think one of the barriers to distributed generation, and this isn't necessarily just from a BC perspective, but you know, I think we've seen this down in the States and more broadly as well, is that the soft costs are really high, right? And a barrier for more widespread deployment. I was actually just reading through something on the soft cost for wind energy and how those changed so fundamentally between, you know, the 1980s until now, and actually where that was a large portion of the decreased in cost for wind. And I think we need to, I think that's where we can start to look back to policy levers to promote, and this is coming out of some work of the DOE as well, starting to actually take a strategic shift in this direction, away from policy that is supporting a single project or a single initiative, to more changing a more fundamental or system-wide shift that reduces soft costs broadly. And I think that's where we could perhaps look to our policymakers to facilitate some of that shift in terms of reducing soft costs of these. You know, this comes back to you know, having streamlined regulations. That was one of the examples that they gave in the wind industry was, you know, having streamlined regulations that bidders to projects could understand relatively easily and then cost their projects appropriately. And that's sort of, you know, to me, it's sort of an appealing recommendation because it seems, at least from an engineering perspective, you know, straightforward. We're not talking about nuts and bolts here. We're talking about streamlining processes and having the skills and the people in place at the right time, at the right place to break down some of those softer barriers. So I think that I guess, yeah, so sort of a two-part response to that question. I think, you know, all of the above. I don't think we're necessarily in a position to be shutting things down or shutting different pathways down at this point, but that soft cost in particular, I think, is a barrier for distributed resources, and that we can, I think we have examples, especially in the renewable energy space, not with distributed resources, but with other shifts that have happened in the energy system in the last few decades, that we can look to where some of those barriers around soft costs and creating that broader ecosystem, that push-pull, and that really juicy market space there for industry to come and play in and exploit. And I think that to get there, we can really look to our policymakers and our regulators to streamline some of those processes and to remove some of those barriers around soft costs.
Interesting, thank you. So, looking at the time, we've got more questions coming in than we're going to be able to answer, which is, I guess, a sure sign that we've got a topic that resonates with people. Got a couple of questions in here, Mark, related to availability of RNG and just how, you know, I know that there's a target of 15%, as I understand it, by 2030. Realistically, how much RNG is possible in BC at this stage?
Well, in theory, and in theory only, it could probably come entirely from woody biomass in this province. From a practical perspective, that is it's probably not possible for a variety of reasons, mainly economic. There's no way to go and collect all of the wood in the field. You know, you can only get what's available in pulp mills. It's expensive. So it is one of the things we're looking at to get us to our 30% by 30 goal. So in addition to that, I mean, we're looking at creating hydrogen in a variety of ways, as I mentioned earlier. In some senses, that's from the same. It may be from the same sources, but we're also looking at ways that we can create hydrogen from methane at the same carbon intensity as electrolysis from hydroelectric dams. We're looking at continuing to look hard at just decarbonizing the transportation sector. And there's a huge opportunity there, especially, you know, trucking will slowly move to electric drivetrains, whether they're battery electric or fuel cell electric. But marine applications are going to continue to be heavily diesel unless we convert them to something else, right? And so, you know, we've been just looking at ferry routes so far, but we need to start looking at intercoastal shipping and transatlantic, trans-Pacific shipping. So there is no single way for us to get to the 30%, that's for sure. And we cannot rely on renewable gases alone. Sorry, the one other pillar that I didn't mention is carbon capture, micro carbon capture. And we're looking at, we've got a pilot in place right now with a company out of Calgary called Clean02, and we're looking at other carbon capture options as well. So many things. Oh, and I also forgot demand side management, working hard on that, right? So it's a complex set of solutions to a very complex problem.
And that leads me then to the final question for the three of you. I'm afraid we're not going to get to all of the questions that are answering all of the comments either that are being raised. But this is coming in the context of the Core Cleantech cluster. Now, as I think all of you have commented, there's a lot of issues at play. There are a lot of decisions that need to be made. So I'd like sort of a last word from each of you answering the question, how can the Core Cleantech cluster help support all the different objectives that we've been talking about today? And once again, Cole, I'd like, if you could kick off on that, where do you see something like the Core cluster supporting the objectives that you've laid out?
It's a good question. I think just first and foremost, it's opportunity. I think that's what First Nations want, and the clean energy industry is, you know, we want opportunity to be able to get things going and not be able to move forward with our projects. So I think there are some good recommendations here, and having a renewed call for independent power production. And including the First Nations in the, you know, in a top level decision making or collaborative decision making model, so that we can, you know, address these systemic issues that I've talked about earlier. I can't speak to hydrogen or some of these newer technologies, but I think just from a First Nations perspective is, you know, opportunity and not to be excluded, and that we have an opportunity to make this a just transition. And I think that's key moving forward, is that it's not just technical issues that we have to work through, but it's also political, and how we can, you know, be an example of how we can build a society that, you know, doesn't replicate the problems of the past. And so I think that there are some good things in this Cleantech cluster, and I just want to thank you for including me in this webinar, and thank you to my fellow panelists for your contributions. Appreciate your input.
Thank you. Mark, your thoughts on how can the Core cluster support the objectives?
I think it's by supporting our continued intensive research into distributed generation, and I mean by that not just electricity, but also the renewable gases that we've been talking about and carbon capture. We need there's a lot of development that needs to go on there. Utilities are in a good place to lead that initially, and some of the tech companies in the province and the country. And we need to ensure that, you know, Core and the provincial and federal governments are focused on getting us down these this diversified pathway to achieving our clean energy goals.
Thank you. And then Madeline.
Yeah, I would come back to I think that really there's a role in the province for some consortium building and to bring in the different stakeholders who have identified various opportunities like the ones that Cole was talking about, bring together those different infrastructure systems, whether it's you know, Fortis and the natural gas system, BC Hydro and the electricity system. Researchers coming from different perspectives, engineering versus economics, so on and so forth, and to really fill that gap that I see that we have in the BC context of bringing those insights together and creating a shared vision and creating a shared pathway that can then be used to foster or used as evidence for very inclusive and just policy making that will, you know, bridge the decarbonization, growing the economy, creating opportunities within the province, so on and so forth. And so I think I think there is a really important role there in the province that that Core could play in terms of bringing that those key stakeholders and that consortium together, and really start then that consortium could start to address some of the very structural changes, very fundamental changes that I think that we need in order to be successful in this transition.
Excellent, thank you. So my thanks to all three of you. It's been really informative, some really interesting and engaging topics. I particularly like your suggestion, Madeline, a consortium, because that's something that absolutely a cluster can work on. So I will pass that suggestion then on to Catriona for her to wrap up.
Great, thank you everybody. That was a really good discussion, and thank you all for the Q&A as well that came in. Really interesting thoughts and opinions, and I hope we were able to answer some of those today. I believe there's some questions we didn't get around to answering, but we can look at those after the webinar and make sure we get back to people. If anyone is interested in the Core Cleantech cluster and our strategy, please go to the website, corecleantech.com. If you have any questions regarding the webinar series or any of the work that we're doing, just please contact me. This is my email address at the bottom. We will have a transportation webinar in September, and that will probably be on I believe it's the 9th. We'll make sure that this email list gets the invitation. And we're taking a break for August because we've been doing this weekly for the past 5 months since COVID started. So we're taking a little break. It's a
grueling schedule, Catriona.
It hasn't all been me, thankfully. We have a team, a really great team of Foresight. But I really want to say thanks to everyone for joining today and for your engagement. Really appreciate it, and have a wonderful day. Okay, bye.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Cole and Madeline.